Right, so hi everybody, I'm Miriam Escofet and I'm here to tell you about commissions that I've been involved in. But again, before I do that, I think I'll just give you a kind of a brief synopsis of how I arrived at where I am today in terms of my work and my painting practice. And I think I might have slightly over-delivered in terms of content with the lecture, so feel free to prompt me if you feel I'm waffling too much, seriously. Just so you know, I started off, I studied 3D design at Brighton, and it was a very craft-based course. And the reason I did that is because when I went to art school, which was late 80s, early 90s, most fine art courses were very, very conceptual. Most fine art courses that I was aware of. And I knew I wanted to either make or to paint, but I wasn't a conceptual artist. So I decided to do something that was skills-based and practical. And I've always loved making, and in a sense, I'm a maker before I'm a painter. I'm a painter now, but really a lot of what I do comes from the fact that I like making things. So that's really at the core of my painting. And so when I left art school, I spent quite a few years making big sort of ornamental ceramic pieces that were very kind of inspired by architectural ornament and architecture, which were kind of my two passions at the time and still are. I mean, there's a lot more passions have joined that little kind of club of passions, but at the time that was really what I was completely obsessed with, and very much borrowing elements from all over the shop really, and just making objects that I wanted to make and just enjoying making things. And so just showing you a few examples of the work that I was doing at the time. And then I started to get commissions for paintings for strange sort of subject matter like this. So this was obviously a sort of trompe l'oeil themed, sort of kind of false cupboard doors to hide a kitchen in a Swiss chalet, and this was painted in acrylics. And in a sense, I mean, it's not something I would go back to doing now, but in a sense, I sort of cut my teeth as a painter on getting projects like this, because you have to satisfy the brief, you have to be able to do something that looks realistic, that looks convincing. And so I taught myself a lot of skills about sort of painting in the process of doing these commissions. And then gradually, I started to find that I became actually very interested in the possibilities of what you can do with space on the picture plane, which are very different to the possibilities of space when you're actually making something. And that was a sort of fascination. I wasn't even aware that that was a fascination, but looking back, I think that's what was going on. And so I had been looking for many years at a lot of architectural drawings, and especially kind of historic architectural drawings that were very inventive in the way that they kind of describe kind of cross sections of buildings, and they're quite imaginative and playful. So I was sort of doing slight interpretations of that in my paintings. I think this was my first oil painting, by the way. My oil painting technique has moved on immensely since those times. And by the way, the picture quality on this screen is not very good. So yes, up until that point, I'd been working mainly in watercolor and acrylics, which are fine as mediums. But the minute I touched oils, I just knew that oil was the medium for me, basically. Just because of the kind of degree of realism that you can express through oil, which I find you can't quite with other painting medium. And this was very much a painting, along these lines that I've been describing. So this was a sort of, I became obsessed with Christopher Wren and all his architecture that is all over London, especially in the city. And this was a kind of obsessive project of cataloguing all of Christopher Wren's churches in one painting. And so presenting them in this sort of imaginary kind of space. And this painting was, I had an exhibition in a gallery in London, and a gentleman saw this painting, fell in love with it, fell in love with what I was doing with my work, and commissioned these two paintings from me, which were quite a big, important commission at the time. I will move on to portraits, I promise, but I'm just sort of showing you the context of how I led up to what I'm doing now. And so the brief was for a pair of paintings to hang in. He was building himself a sort of private gallery space to house his little collection of sculptures. He's got a very nice little collection of sculptures. And he's also a very intelligent, well-read man, and he's read a lot about history and politics, which are his passion, really. So he came up with the idea, the theme, which was one painting had to be on the theme of great leaders, which is the one on the left, and the other had to be on the theme of great thinkers. But other than that, and he was very specific about, and all the characters had to be represented by a sculpture of them, of which there are many, but some I actually had to invent because I couldn't find existing sculptures of these individuals. So he was very particular about the people that he wanted to inhabit these paintings, the characters. But in terms of the picture space, he left that entirely up to me, which was really lovely. I can't remember exactly how he expressed it, but he sort of said, I'm not going to interfere with the imaginative process of the artist. I want you to deliver on that score. I'm just going to be very specific about who has to be in the paintings. So it was actually a very nice collaboration, and because it was such a big commission, and I had never really had such a kind of big commission before, I was very worried in a sense that I should get it absolutely right for him. So obviously these are the finished paintings. The first step was to resolve the space, and which is all completely invented and constructed. But these are the 4 sketches that I presented to him based on sort of generic, slightly classical, kind of grand tour images of private sculpture collections, you know, that kind of imagery. And they're kind of fairly loosely cobbled together, if you like, but I just wanted to present him kind of 4 different scenarios. And the preferred ones were the 2 at the bottom, which I then, the next step on from that was to construct this kind of space in a convincing way for these fairly large format paintings. So I had to give myself a bit of a crash course on proper perspective. You know, perspective is something that we all sort of understand, but actually to draw perspective very convincingly in an architectural space in a painting is actually quite mind-boggling in a really thrilling way. And this is actually very straightforward one-point perspective, so there's nothing even fancy going on. And it's a skill, it's one of those many skills in the visual arts that have been lost with time. Because, you know, we're so used to working from kind of already processed, digested images, which is great, that can be very freeing too. But the idea of literally constructing a space from scratch in the way that Renaissance artists would have done was really it was scary, I have to say, because I thought I could fall flat on my face here, but it actually worked. And this was the construction for the other painting, which was more of a temple-like construction, and just details with the various sculptures. I could go through them all, but I don't think it's necessary to sort of point out all the, some of them are instantly recognizable. And I sort of came up with the idea of introducing the human scale in the painting as well. So this is actually my brother posing for me. And then when I was actually doing the paintings, a couple of other elements crept in that weren't... I'm somebody who tends to plan my paintings quite carefully and quite precisely. So I sort of start off with a clear idea of what the finished image is going to be. But nevertheless, there's always a point when you're painting where actually the painting starts to, in a sense, take over and asks you for what it wants. And however much in control of it you are, it's actually really good to surrender to that. So there are little elements that crept into the painting which I hadn't envisaged. So this is a kind of correlation of these details in the actual finished paintings. The client actually also had an idea halfway through the process that he wanted me to put myself in the painting, which I was slightly resistant to, but actually I think it's a nice sort of touch, really. And this is another friend of mine posing in the distance. These are other various friends of mine. And then there's another little touch which came to me right at the end of the painting. So if you look here, there's a sort of avenue that just disappears, I thought, into a sort of Arcadian landscape or whatever. And then I thought I'd place a little temple at the end of it, which again is kind of very classical. But of course this temple is this building here. And I didn't tell the client that. And I think after he'd had the painting for a couple of months or 3 months, he called me up and he said, "I've just spotted what you did." And he was completely thrilled. It was very nice. And so after that, those carefully, oh, and by the way, these drawings are obviously done on tracing paper so that I can construct the space, and then on another sheet of tracing paper I can move the figures around the elements of the sculptures and see. So there's a kind of slightly jigsaw puzzle element aspect of the design aspect of it. And then this would be, well, these were the images that I presented to the client as a kind of, for his final approval really, which are about as specific as you can get in terms of painting, showing him where areas. You'll notice that the design of this building is actually different from the design of the drawing that I showed you before. I got slightly carried away. I've been looking at a lot of kind of Baroque architectural drawings, and there are drawings by these brothers called Gali Bibiena, who were actually theatre designers, but they did a lot of architectural drawings, and they would come up with these kind of fantastical fairy cake type buildings, which I thought were absolutely wonderful. Of course, the client, who's actually a bit more sober and classical than I am in his taste, looked at it and he said, I don't think this would pass building regs, so I think we'll have to modify the design. So anyway, it became this, and these are the paintings in his. I don't have a more panoramic view of the gallery space, but this is a rather nice shot of the painting with some of his sculptures. And the other one here. And by the way, he has I think this is, let me get this right. This is Napoleon and Wellington in front of each painting, which is a rather nious touch. And later on, he came back wanting to commission a sort of drawing version of that Christopher Wren painting with all the churches, which was kind of like the genesis, the point for the start of the commission. I think this whole process was very enjoyable for him as well as for me, and I think for me, it catapulted my work into a much more ambitious vein. So similar to what you were saying earlier, that some commissions actually embolden you to try things that you might not have tried, and this whole idea of constructing a completely fictitious space, although I'd sort of toyed around with that in some of my paintings before, I hadn't quite gone the full Monty on it, if you like. And so, subsequent to that, I started doing this kind of much more sort of dramatic paintings in terms of the space that they depict. And of course, the theme of sculptures then also, I realised that actually sculpture is a very nice theme to explore in painting. And this is a more recent painting, which is also, in a sense, a descendant from that commission. And then we get onto portraits. And so this portrait on the left, which is also out there for you to see, is a portrait of my father, who, by the way, is also a painter. And it was the first proper portrait, if you like, that I had painted, and that was in 2007. So actually about less than 10 years ago. So I arrived at Portraiture after many, many years of doing a lot of kind of architectural, still life-based work. And I think that was a good thing, really, because I think I had a lot of skills under my belt when I arrived at Portraiture, which is actually quite a difficult thing to tackle. Also in terms of the context of the portrait. Of course, the challenge for me is actually to realise that portraiture is all about the individual and not about the setting. Although the setting is important, the individual is the star of the piece. It's a one-subject painting, whereas a lot of my paintings tend to be many subject paintings. There's a lot of threads coming into the work. Portraiture is actually more simple in a funny way. That's why it's more challenging, because there's nowhere to hide. You can't be so clever with it. You can be quite clever with other types of painting, but not with portraiture. So yes, this was the portrait of my father, 2007, which I decided to enter for the BP Portrait Award, and it got in, which was great. And then hot on the foot of that one was the portrait of my brother on the right here. All portrait artists start painting their friends and family first, because you need subject matter to paint. And then this was my first portrait commission. He was a friend, met him through a friend of a friend, basically, called Michael Reynolds, and he's let me get this right, he's a creative director, I think is the proper title, who's based in New York, and he'd seen my work before and really loved it, but he particularly liked I think it was this portrait here of my brother that kind of triggered the idea. And he particularly liked the kind of, also the still life element in my work. And this portrait is quite biographical in the sense that, so he, you know, he's of kind of, his grandparents came from Sicily to New York, and I don't think they brought a fig tree with them. I think I got that wrong. I think they planted a fig tree in their house in New York as a reminder of their kind of heritage from Sicily. So Michael wanted that element of the fig in the painting as a sort of allegory of his kind of family inheritance. And also the big crystal and the big skull. He's very interested in kind of esoteric matters. And he's quite a kind of dramatic personality and quite baroque in his own way, quite interesting in themes of death. And the whole element of the vanitas, memento mori painting genre, which is fascinating. And also, you know, I remember when we had the first conversation about the portrait, he mentioned the word Holbein, which of course is my absolute hero in terms of portraiture. So I knew we were onto a good thing because, so there's a slight kind of Holbein-esque touch to the whole composition of this portrait. And this is a photograph of the portrait in situ in his apartment in New York. And this is an elephant skull, so the kind of death theme continues. And then this was my next portrait commission of Lorenzo, who's actually here in the room at the back. Hello, Lorenzo. Looking somewhat older than he was when I painted him here. I think he was 6. I think we established he was 6 when I painted this portrait. And of course, they also know Michael, so they'd seen the portrait of Michael and thought it looked incredibly like him and really liked it. So they wanted to commission a portrait of their son. And in a sense, they wanted the portrait to reflect his world at that stage in his infancy. And of course, any child's world is his toys at the age of 6. So they came to the studio and I worked from photographs with this portrait because there's no way a child's going to sit still for you for a great length of time. And they brought an option of clothes, I remember, and a selection of his toys to the studio. And we had half a day, really, when I was just photographing him. They also slightly alarmingly brought a sample of his wallpaper that he had in his bedroom, which was Masters of the Universe, and suggested that might make a nice backdrop for the portrait. And I can't remember how I reacted at the time, but it was one of those moments when I thought, oh dear, because I'm a very classical person in my taste, and I always like very quiet, sober backgrounds but you know, obviously I wanted to deliver that in some way to them. And then I came up with the idea of actually turning the wallpaper into a tetra, whatever it's called. I should know because I use these objects a lot in my paintings, which I think was a rather nice touch because it's sort of, it follows that playful element of the toys. But also there's that great tradition of kind of Renaissance portraits where there were these sort of geometric objects which were, you know, meant to represent great seriousness and great authority and intelligence of the sitter. So I thought it was a nice touch to turn it into a slightly more playful thing. And also I really wanted to paint these objects as if I were painting the most exquisite artifacts. You know, I thought just because they're plastic toys does not mean they don't deserve absolute respect. So I treated them as I would any other still life object. And yeah, and these was the sort of layout drawings that I did for the, I think the finished portrait is pretty much as in this drawing here, but just exploring different. Also to mention that Lorenzo's parents are fantastically brilliant still life photographers, so they have a fantastic eye. So it was a pleasure. And I felt very safe working in collaboration with them. So they had a very clear idea of how they wanted the painting to look, and we're very in tune in our taste. So there was that was really a marriage made in heaven in that sense. And they have the portrait hanging up in their bedroom, and it does look very lovely.